Hello all, welcome to the show. I'm Gus Gagliardi and this is Fire Code Tech. On Fire Code Tech, we interview fire protection professionals from all different careers and backgrounds in order to provide insight and a resource for those in the field. My goal is to help you become a more informed fire protection professional. Fire Code Tech has interviews with engineers and researchers, fire marshals, and insurance professionals, and highlights topics like codes and standards, engineering systems, professional development, and trending topics in the industry. So if you're someone who wants to know more about fire protection or the fascinating stories of those who are in the field, you're in the right place. Hello all. Welcome to episode 58 of Fire Code Tech. On this episode, we're speaking once again with Wojciech Węgrzyński. Wojciech is a friend of the podcast and the host of the Fire Science Show. In this episode, we get some updates on what has been happening with the Fire Science Show, and Wojciech details his chapter in the new published handbook titled The Handbook of Fire and the Environment by SFPE. Wojciech's chapter in specific talks about fire and smoke modeling. He evaluates how we can use fire and smoke modeling to better understand how fires impact the environment and what methods we can use to predict and protect individuals from the hazard of fire and the pollutants that are involved. If you enjoyed this episode, please go check out the Fire Science Show. Wojciech has a wide variety of topics and he really gets at some fascinating scientific points of view that we don't as often cover on Fire Code Tech. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for Fire Code Tech and the Fire Science Show and give us a follow on social media. Also, if you enjoy the content and you want to give us a big favor, give us a 5-star review on Apple iTunes Podcasts. Let's get into the show. Well, Wojciech, welcome back to Fire Code Tech. Thanks for coming on the show, sir.
Thank you so much, Gus. Very happy to be here with you again.
Nice. Well, yeah, the Fire Code Tech Show goes round 2, I guess. Or What is it? The Fire Science Code Tech Show.
That was a good one. I really enjoyed that mashup. It was a nice one.
It was fun. Yeah, well, I wanted to just, start off by getting an update of what you've been thinking about the podcast. We were chatting a little bit off air, but I'm sure everybody is interested about, how you've been feeling about it and what's been going on, and just a little bit of background on the behind the scenes for Wojciech.
Yeah, cool. I'm not very often sharing behind the scenes on Fire Science Show in the Fire Science Show, so I guess it makes more sense to share it in here. It's been fun. It's been a great year. Definitely a chance to meet and talk with people that I would not usually talk to, and that was really good. Discovering a lot of new, super smart, super intelligent people who do groundbreaking research in fire. For me as an academic, broadening my field of view, so that has been excellent, and I really like it a lot. People seem to like and enjoy it, so makes me very happy to get feedback from outside of my closet. And I'm nowhere close to stopping doing that. Quite opposite. I'm very happy to do this project, continue this project, and my head is buzzing with ideas how to make it better, how to grow it. So many new routes open up, and I hope it's the early days of the Fire Science Show, and you're gonna hear a lot more from it. Hopefully, we'll see.
I would bet on it with you behind the wheel. But no, that's awesome to hear about. Yeah, I definitely know what you mean about the podcast opening up new doors. But yeah, I was wondering with your newest writing endeavor that you were sharing with me, but how has the symbiotic relationship of the podcast, how has that influenced other areas of your career? Because I know for me, I've seen it have subtle and not so subtle influence on knowledge and just opportunities.
Yeah, that's kind of an intriguing question, Gus. I mean, first things first. I'm a scientist and an engineer. I'm podcaster is a third hat, if I may, and definitely my prime career is the Wojciech the scientist. I'm the guy who does fire experiments and measures stuff and tries to publish that and shares the knowledge through academic papers mainly. So it's difficult to say to what extent did these worlds overlap that much. I would say that I found podcast as an excellent way to communicate the research. Like this is something absolutely great and it's working like magic. And it was one of the reasons why I've started podcasts. Sometimes you go to a conference and there's a person, they're talking about the research, they're giving a 10-minute presentation, and it's like you can go asleep. Sometimes it's really difficult to capture all the knowledge that person is trying to share, giving their best. And I'm not saying people are lazy or something, or unskilled, but it's just the way how it is in conferences. And then after the conference, you go for a beer with that person and you can spend like 3 hours in the pub talking about that research, and it is fascinating. And I couldn't get that out of my head. Why? The same person, the same topic, the same thing in one place is very difficult to digest. On the other hand, it's so approachable, so nice, so juicy. Like you can learn so much from talking to people. And I figured out the context it makes the difference, and this human to human interaction makes the difference. And I've bet on that while starting the podcast, and it worked out. It really seems to be the thing. Like when you talk to people, they open up. When you ask them questions, they light up inside and they want to talk. I, you may know the feeling of talking to 200 people in a room and you don't really have a good idea if any of them is listening. Like, people on their phones, people watching around, someone talking with somebody else on the side, someone leaving the room middle of the talk. You don't know if they left because it's horrible talk or they just received a very important phone. You don't know that. It's stressful. And here, once you forget this is being recorded, once you forget this is going to be shared with hundreds of thousands or thousands of people, you open up and you can just give the science to the world. And this is the interaction between podcasting and academia that I enjoy the most, I must say. I'm not taking that big advantage of my podcast with my research because there's a lot happening at ITB and at my research group, which I guess I could have a whole podcast about the research we are just doing, but I wanted my show to be a venue for everyone else and a whole community of people, scientists. So yeah, that's number one influence.
Yeah. Well, maybe one day you'll have a media network where you can have a whole litany of fire scientists talking on different podcasts on a channel one day. We don't know. I won't sell you short yet. I think you got it in you.
Yeah, media empire. That would be
There you
great.
go.
I thought at the start I thought the fire science is too small even for a podcast. So but I was very wrong. I was very wrong.
So niche. It's so niche, and like I wonder that same thing sometimes. I'm like, is it such a like a small subset of an audience? Like, is there enough people? I really didn't even know. Like, I was excited when I was having 10 or 12 people listen to the podcast. I was excited. On a weekly basis, I was like, this is awesome. I can't believe that people are even listening to me right now. Like, what the heck even is happening? So I love all what you're saying.
When considering that, I thought it's a small audience, but it's an audience that deserves a great shows, great content, and let's do this and see what happens. And it turned out cool. Yeah, from the opposite side, like how does podcasting influence my work as a scientist? I get the chance to listen every single episode of Fire Science Show because I record them, I edit them, I listen to them. So I'm a very solid consumer of my own content. And I honestly think listening to podcasts like yours and mine, and there's others, is probably the easiest way for passive career development. Like there is no other as easy investment of your time, even in time. It can be considered even entertainment in a way, and yet you learn so much. So from every interview, I learn something that eventually gets implemented in my science. But I would get that by listening to the podcast. I wouldn't have to make the podcast to have that. If I was just listening to the podcast, which I am, I would still benefit in a very, very similar way. So yeah, I think it's a great medium and one that's very easy but very rewarding.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, I wanted to ask, I feel like I'm just getting selfish here and I'm asking you all the podcast questions up front, but I wanted to ask just like, and I think you've like spoke a little bit about, how it's been and how things are going, but yeah, I mean, like I love hearing about you saying you're scheming, you're thinking about ways to grow it, but like what dreams do you have if you could share any for what you would like to do with the Fire Science Show? Like, yeah, where do you see it going?
Yeah, first and foremost, I would like it to continue for a very long time. Like, I would love to one day wake up and think about, I don't know, 10 years of interviews I've done with the fire scientists, see in the podcast a reflection of how the field grown, how it evolved, how one thought fueled another. I I mean, doing it for a year, I can already see a repository of hours of interesting interviews. But I really wonder how will it look after like 5 or 10 years of doing that. How big it will be. What great thoughts will be in it. I would love to, interview today some undergraduate student learned that 10 years forward they're a famous professor, and it was first communicated. These are the dreams, really. They're very down to earth. I don't dream about building a tycoon of podcasts or have to know the number one show on the planet or something. I don't care that much. I'm reaching my goals with what I'm doing, and I would honestly like really love to continue and just like reflect on how it influences lives of others. That's very rewarding on its own. Obviously, I would love to get the show sponsored one day, or get something rolling that. And I think it's important for podcast longevity. It's a thing that definitely helps, but it's not a goal on its own. It's something that would be nice as an added part of this
Yeah.
routine.
Yeah, I think I mean, I'm sure you're already at a place where if you just started going and chasing sponsors, you could get them. It's just the time to do all that on top of
Yeah,
your three other jobs. You're an engineer, you're a scientist, you're a podcast, you're a father. Like,
yeah.
you got maybe a spare couple seconds left in the day that you probably need for your sanity. So if you if you really wanted those sponsors, I'm sure you could go get them. But I feel like you have like a philosopher's soul when you speak about these things. That
Oh, thank you.
I always enjoy listening to you. But I find myself just like going into I'm listening to a Wojciech podcast mode, even though I'm supposed to be interviewing you. So I need to be careful
Cool.
about listening to you.
Okay, that's cool. I'll just pop a 3 minute timer to not exceed.
You just make sure you start snapping if I look like
Yeah, yeah.
I'm glazed over and I'm just like listening to you too intently.
Cool,
But
man. Cool.
no, I wanted to talk to you. You shared with me like a new project that you just finished, and I saw that Brian Meacham was sharing it on LinkedIn too after we were talking about it, and super exciting. But I really wanted to dive in this conversation and talk about your new chapter in the Handbook of Fire and the Environment.
It's such an exciting project, and I was delighted to be invited by Brian to participate in that project. It's a handbook. It's called the Handbook of Fire and Environment. It's within the, let's say, environment of SFP handbooks. So it's a completely new development that hopefully will be sustained and growing as its own thing. It's large. Well, handbook is a large book. It's large book, many chapters with great people, all focused around the environmental impact of fires on the environment, but also in a cultural way, in a socio economic way. So all the different ways how fires impact society. Editors of the book are Brian Mitchum, who you've mentioned, and Professor Margaret McNamee from Sweden. So they're both co-editors of the book. They were leading the whole thing, and I had Margaret on my podcast some time ago. We were talking about sustainability in the built environment, and this is also something that fits into the puzzle of fires and the environment. So the book itself, it started, I don't know, 3 maybe 4 years ago. It takes a long time to publish a handbook, man. It's like you and me are on a tight schedule with the podcast and almost a weekly job. It takes years to publish a book of this magnitude, and it's amazing. It's even if you do your best job, and at the moment when it's published, the references in it are already 2 years old, because it takes so much time to process the book. But it's cool. The book is out there, and the knowledge there is worth sharing. Absolutely. If you want, sorry, the story of the handbook like goes far back, and it has been triggered by the how fires do damage environment. We've been more and more aware of the effects fires do to environment, in terms of smoke polluting the air, in terms of the soil and water damage that is done from fire and extinguishing actions. We had some huge like petrochemical fires, huge chemical plant fires that their effects on the environment around was very profound. But we also had fires like the tragic Grenfell Tower or the Notre Dame Paris Cathedral fires, which were just buildings inside of a city, and yet they had environmental consequences if you look through that layer on them. So it's something we are becoming more and more aware, and this handbook was a way to answer this need for the society to be able to quantify, measure, model that to better understand these impacts. So yeah, that's the
Yeah.
handbook.
Wow. That's incredible to hear you talk about like the scope of a document like this. I mean, I guess it makes complete sense when you have this many authors, this much like peer review, and this much just process to compile it all. You know, thousands of pages probably, or I don't know how roughly how long it is, but it's
Like 500, but it's a massive work.
yeah, 500. Man, that's still like a dense, but man, so much to be gleaned about it too. And so but yeah, it's exciting and cool to see a little bit of your wind talk. I
Hmm.
didn't get through the entire chapter over that you wrote, but
Oh man,
man,
it's way
it'd
too
probably
long.
take me months to get through it. But I was like
uh,
trying to read it and not just read it, but understand it. I could read it and just like go through it and my eyes go over it and be like, yep, that went inside my brain for a moment, or just like go through it, try to pick it apart. I was taking notes, but it was really interesting to get like a little bit more on your wind talk, and I feel like that's your baby, like this
yeah.
idea and this thing that you really love to. So it was cool for me to get a little bit of a peek behind the curtain for that lecture and that discussion that we had talked about. And honestly, when we were doing our first talk, you were
Yep.
giving hints about the wind talk when you came
Yeah.
back. So it was like perfect timing.
Perfect timing. Yeah.
So, but yeah, so let's get into that. Let's talk about like, you know, I guess let's get into so like who would benefit from reading this book? Like who's kind of like the audience or the target?
Mm,
I mean, I can definitely see people who are like yourself and like the firm I work for at times, like performance-based design professionals are people who deal with fire and just the sociology of it, the science of it,
mm.
all the parameters, like they can benefit by reading your chapter. But yeah, maybe you have a greater sense of who's a good audience for this document.
It's a tough question, because I would love to say everybody, and that's a horrible answer to such a post questions, which I now know, being a content creator. If your content is for everybody, it's for no one. So I'll try to wrap up who would be a perfect recipient of this chapter, like who I would like to give this book in a present and tell them you will really, really benefit from reading this. And I think it would be an engineer, not necessarily dealing with the building design, but one that wants to understand a bigger picture, or because of the work they're doing, they have to understand the bigger picture, the context of what they're being designing, be it a a building, a tunnel, a road, a system, a bigger community even. If you're involved in design and you would like to understand another layer of perception of your fire, like if you're in the building, we usually care, okay, is your ISO time higher than your required time? And if that is, you're good. If not, then you're bad. What are your concentrations inside? But as soon as the smoke is exhausted outside of that compartment, you don't think about where it's going to fly, how far can it fly, who's going to be vulnerable to that smoke, and actually even how much will there be emitted out of your fire. It's not something we consider today that much while designing buildings or other systems. I'm not saying we should always do that, but I am also sure that in certain cases we would benefit from understanding what our buildings, what threats our building pose to the surroundings. And as I mentioned, the cases of Grenfell or Notre Dame, it was a single building burned down. And yet it had some environmental consequences in its nearest surroundings outside of all the other damage that was caused by these tragedies. So even as the fire of a single building can do a lot of harm to the surroundings. And to understand that, like, how can you understand what the impact will be? You have to calculate it in a way. Like, we're engineers, we are supposed to not give a random answer based on our feeling or intuition, but we are ought to calculate and measure and model. So this is what we were invited for in this chapter. Previously, as you've mentioned, we've been known for our work in wind and fire coupled modeling and environmental modeling of the fire outcomes is largely related to the atmospheric winds. I mean, winds will be driving force for the contamination. So it was very easy to find a link between our work that was focusing on the winds and fires inside the buildings and extending it to understand how the winds affect the consequences of the fire outside of the building. We were focused on the inside, but it was very easy switch to also take a look at the greater picture outside. Now, one thing that we were doing, we were usually focusing on numerical modeling with CFD, computational fluid dynamics, which is something that gives you great answers, but in a very near proximity of your building, because it's very detailed simulation. You can do a simulation of a whole city, but it's quite expensive and you probably don't want to do that all the time. So we thought with my co-author, Tomasz Lipecki from the Lublin Technical University, we thought, okay, so we have this understanding of the great model CFD on the near field, but there's plenty of other models being used, which I also, due to my personal career and other developments previously I've known, we should like broaden it. So this is why in this chapter we take the reader into a journey. First, we try to discuss what is a fire emission, and there's a great chapter in the handbook about that as well. Like, what is a fire? What does it emit? What can you expect from it as a source of heat and smoke? Then we go through multiple types of models with growing complexity. We start with something that's called the box models, where you just assume a whole space is just one thing and you average things out within it, and that's probably the simplest way you can model contamination within an area, but you are constrained by the size of the box, so it works only in certain scenarios. Then we go into Gaussian plume models, where you have a single equation, a Gaussian distribution equation, that allows you to calculate, like, if I emit this amount of smoke in here, given the atmospheric conditions around me, wind blowing in this direction, how much will go like 500 meters away, a kilometer, 5 kilometers away, 10 kilometers away. You can calculate this distribution. Now, the problem with this is a very simple, easy calculation. It's just one equation you solve, but you assume that the weather is not changing. Like, you have one wind direction, one wind velocity, and it's constantly changing. And the bigger scale you go, like if I model a vehicle on a car park, that's probably okay easy-ish to model it like that. But if you model like McMurray fault fire, where you have hundreds of thousands of square meters burning together, and the plume will take days to reach a different place in the US. You cannot model it like that. So you need to take these different things into account. So we go into more complex models. There's models, I love them. They're called puff models, where it's more or less like Gaussian plume model, but you emit puffs of your fire and you model where the puff will go. So let's imagine then each hour of a fire is a single puff. And you just measure, okay, this puff goes here, this one goes here, this one goes here. And based on that, you have a more or less overall image on where the smoke will go. Then you can go into very complicated models, Lagrangian particle models, where you emit Lagrangian particles into three-dimensional setting and you track where they go. It allows you for very high detailed investigation or where the smoke will go. And because of how Lagrangian particles work, you can add chemistry to them. You can play a lot with them. And Eulerian models, where you basically do more or less a CFD of a continent, where you can really model the dispersion with a complicated topography, complicated wind fields, weather. At a cost, obviously, it's not easy, but you can do that. So you have a hierarchy of models that you can use for a particular problem at hand. And of course, CFD, which many of these models, like their weakest thing is the near field, like what's happening directly near to the fire. So that we cover with the CFD. So if you would like to learn about this, the chapter and the handbook would be just for you. Uh, do you need this immediately in your life? I'm not sure, but if a day comes and you will need it, it's there waiting for you. So that's also a point of having a handbook. So if you one day find out yourself in the need for modeling things like this, here you go. It's all there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I think it's stunning reading through your chapter and just like skimming through a little bit how many modeling examples are
Mm.
in this chapter that you produce. I just was thinking about how much time it must have taken to even assemble all all of these
Oh
like
yeah.
different
Oh
modeling
yeah.
examples and all that. I was like, man, I mean,
This
like I've seen CFD before and I saw like some of those, like the cutouts and the nice renderings and like artistic renderings of the wind cityscape and stuff, which was neat that I'd seen from something you presented before. But lots of great, it's not just text, it's like beautiful imagery of modeling and a lot more information and charts and distributions for what's happening with this material. So
Thank you very
um,
much. We wanted it to, like, this is the first and only piece of research you take on this specific topic of modeling environmental impact of fires. We wanted it to at least give you a fairly complete overview. Obviously, we're talking about a whole field of science. There's hundreds of people writing papers of that. There's dozens of models. We were it would be even impossible to give a complete list of models, not even to go and discuss them. So we focused on the ones that we knew are most popular, or the ones we had some experience in. I mean, it's not an exhaustive list. I guess at some stage we'll build up on that and then present a more complete image. But I think it took a few months of work. So for the time associated to make this chapter happen, I think we did a fairly good work completing all of this together, compiling it into one piece of content, the chapter that now is in the hands of engineers to use.
yeah. So, like, how long did it take to like physically write it? Because I've been doing more technical writing recently, and I'm so bad at it. I'm not good at all. And so, I'm just looking at this document and how like nice and polished it is, and like the terminology and everything flowing, and having nice little poetic phrasing in there. And I'm like,
Oh,
gosh, this would take me forever to write this.
I can tell you. Let me find the manuscript folder on my computer. Yeah, from the first draft till the one that we've sent to Brian, it was 4 months of work.
Wow.
Yeah, it was 4 months. I remember quite vividly. I've spent my entire Christmas break reading literature and writing that. It was fun, like 10 hours a day reading
Oh
and
my
and
gosh.
writing. I like this. It was not a pain. I to some extent enjoyed it. It was nice to learn. The more pain comes when you have to like rephrase stuff and put it into context. So yeah, it was a few months, and then obviously it was like 2 years in editing. Many people having it in their hands, criticizing, making changes, editorials, and stuff like that. So the final product is a product of the work of many people. So it's not something you just go in and write overnight. But yeah,
Yeah.
just writing it was months.
Wow, that's incredible. That's cool. I don't think I've ever written anything that should have taken months into months.
Oh, now
Maybe a
with
term paper as a student that I put off for too long took me months to write, but I guarantee I wasn't writing that whole time.
no, it's like, and I don't think I would have time to write it now again with the podcast with the podcast project on my back. So I'm not sure if I'll ever author another piece like that. Well, maybe I will. We'll see.
I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will. Maybe you'll get that Patreon one day and then you'll be able to outsource some of this editing. But no, I wanted to talk about like it's such a complex process and
Mm,
I just like I'd like to talk with you about just like some of the basic factors for like these modelings, but I know that that's just like what's the basic factors of fire, which but also a topic I'd like to discuss with you is just like, so if we had infinite computing power,
mm.
like what would we be able to do with these like models, like a CFD for a whole city? Like if you could like model whatever, pick a reasonable sized city, but if you could model a reasonable sized city and you had infinite computing power, could you get like a reasonable approximation of like wind distribution of pollutants over a city from a fire? I mean, like I was seeing you having some examples of the different zone modeling and like near and the different compartments, but yeah, I just wanted to ask that because my brain always jumps to
Actually,
what's the extreme.
yeah, we don't have to go into abstract thinking. I think I can give you examples of citywide simulations because we're actually doing them right now. Maybe not on a moderately sized city, but on like a square kilometer of a city, which is like quite a large chunk of a large city. So it takes us using our 128 cores of 128 CPUs, it takes us 24 hours to simulate a fire with all the distributions around it. So it's not something that will come in the future. It's something that we'll already have. It's just not that many people are using that yet. If you wanted to what would we do if we had crazy amount of power and like infinite resources? Uh, I'm not like you can spend whatever amount of resources you want to increase the fidelity of your simulations. You can always use a smaller resolutions of your mesh. You can always use more complicated models. Does it translate to better simulations? Not necessarily. It's not such a direct link. I mean, it's a complicated. I'm actually gonna have a whole podcast episode with Jason Floyd about that, like in a month. So there's the answer is it's complicated, but not so easy. One thing that we like the issues are with the problem definition, not with the solution. If you think about wind, like what's wind, like what direction, what velocity, what gusts, what we there's even a thing called the atmospheric stability, and based on that you get different wind profiles if you have a sunny clear day or if you have a very low cloud layer. You'll have completely different atmospheric conditions in those 2 days. You can have a wind in the winter, you can have a wind in the summer. So the amount of different wind contexts you can run into is endless, like in endless amount of fires you can have. So if I had an access to infinite computational power, I would do infinite number of simulations like concurrently to each other to really work out probability distributions and see a risk-based image of on how wind and fire go together. Like I would love to know with probability of this amount of percent the wind impact will be this, and with this probability it will be like this. And if the wind is extreme, but the probability is very low, the impact is extreme, or maybe it's not. I don't know. Maybe with a wind that is very highly probable, a low velocity flow that occurs every other day, maybe the impact is the biggest. I don't know that. It's something that we're currently actually researching in a project that we're carrying at ITB, and we're somewhere in the middle of it. We're in the numerical calculations now to really measure this impact of wind, different types of wind, different directions in our context, on how the consequences of a fire in an urban settlement are. And then we will be able to say to what extent it is something important or not based on risk. So yeah, I would spend my infinite resources on being able to do risk, not necessarily, doing the fanciest simulation I can.
That makes sense. Yeah. I guess that's the whole thing, is like understanding the very fluid and variable nature of the wind, and just how quickly things can change, the probabilistic, kind of distribution of what could happen, and
Yeah,
the dispersion of the pollutants. I guess that makes sense of, like, do we even know enough about like the way that the wind in the atmosphere to even make that model,
yeah.
even if you had infinite like resources, like you're saying, a valuable use of those, of
I,
that
I'll give you
resource.
I'll give you for a context a nice example. Like a few weeks ago, there was a severe drought in Europe, heat wave, and there was like one of the hottest days ever in UK, and they had a massive number of fires in London that day, like massive number. Like they compared it like it was the worst day since World War II in London in terms of the amount of fires.
Wow.
And because I'm involved in the PyroLife project, I'm on a WhatsApp there, and there was a discussion there, like, and Guillermo was mentioning, and the wind was like very low that day, like 4 meters per second. And I checked it for London, and it seems to be somewhere around the average or median wind. And we understand, or we know that stronger wind usually leads to worse outcomes of fires. Like fire can spread, can grow bigger. It's usually connected with the worst outcomes. So if on the worst day since World War II we had wind that was like around 50% chance, and it was a wind that did possibly not contribute that much to the damage. Like it could have been much, much worse with the worst wind. And if the probability of that was 50%, we essentially won a coin toss, Like if it was not, the outcomes could have been so, so much worse. So this is why we need to understand that and then be able to model that, to predict that. Because if this time we won a coin toss, what's gonna happen on the next worst day since World War II? Will we lose the coin toss, and how horrible will it be? What should we be ready for? Like, do we understand that as a society? I don't think so. So to gain insight into these questions, you first have to solve the fundamentals, which is how do you model them both together, wind and fire. Yeah, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that's awesome. I like that real world context that you're providing. I think that's something that over the history of our discipline has always been such a useful teaching tool, and just way to ground the importance of what we do. It seems like society, it's very easy to forget these tragedies when you exist most of your daily life is not impacted, and then you'll see a flash of something like this on the
Mm.
news, like what you're just saying about London, and it having its worst day for fire since World War II. And it's like, when you can bring to mind something so visceral like that, it really brings home the meaning of
Yeah.
like what we do. And Notre Dame and Grenfell, I mean, two tragedies that they're still talking about to this day. I mean, they're still litigating Grenfell. It would have happened
Yep.
in like 2017, 2016, something like that.
Yeah,
I can't
absolutely.
remember, but it's just incredible how much impact and cultural significance that these fires and this subject has on people. And it just kind of goes under the radar for the culture of how we exist. We just kind of forget about it. Go
Yeah,
back to
we are dealing
go
with
back to
very real
whatever.
problems in fire. Like I mean, in a way it is abstract. In a way, it is something very weird, complex, difficult to understand. You start to realize the complexities. They prevent you from answering most of the questions usually. But in the end, you have down to earth problems like real buildings that burn down, real environments that suffer, real people that suffer, and yeah, that's why we are doing this difficult work to help that, and being down to earth and being able to relate the science to the real world problems. I think it's an engineering science for a reason. Yeah, we have to solve the problems without knowing everything first.
Yeah, so I feel like you covered it pretty well, but just like, so why, I guess I'll just ask instead of trying to put words in your mouth.
Yeah.
What do you find compelling about like wind engineering, or like the computational aspect of wind engineering? I'm trying to be better about not like asking fully loaded questions and just like obviously pushing my thoughts or opinions on people when I am trying to do an interview.
It's cool. Yeah, I like computational wind engineering is something that I find really interesting. I mean, we're using the same tools for fluid mechanics in fire safety engineering and in computational wind engineering, but the culture is very different. They approach their problems in a different way. Like you have different scales in space, for example. Like in wind engineering, you would consider a building and you can go away with 2 meter mesh on the building because it's a big block. But if you consider fire, you need to model like these tiny details that will influence the fire. So here we're in a kind of different world than when wind engineers in terms what we're expected from our models to be. In time scales, in wind engineering, you can most likely go away with steady state simulations, something you never see in fire because fire is a transient event. You have to like the time aspect of a fire is fundamental to the fire, to the safety, to everything happens on the timeline here. And in winds, not really. It's like probability and just a single thing that happens at the time. So you go away with steady state. So in the end, I mean, the tools are the same. I mean, we're also talking about buildings, so the thing you're modeling is the same, but you're doing it in a completely different way. And this is compelling, if you're a guy who's been doing fire modeling their whole professional career, building these buildings, putting fires inside, modeling HVAC systems, smoke control systems, doing the same thing over and over and over again, and then comes someone and tells you, no, you have to do it like, forget about this interior, it's not relevant. It's kind of refreshing, to do something in a completely different way. And when you try to combine both, that's where the magic starts because you cannot simply combine them. Like you cannot put a fire analysis inside of wind analysis; it will not work. It's a different thing. You cannot just drop wind randomly on your fire you just extend the domain by 10 meters and drop wind. It's not gonna work. It's not wind that you're modeling. So it becomes pretty interesting when you try to model the interface between them. It's not so simple, and I like dealing with difficult problems. So I really enjoyed being exposed to this one and trying to maybe not solve, but at least try to work in this difficult setting. So yeah, that is rewarding and compelling and interesting for sure for me, using the fundamentals of computational wind engineering in fire safety engineering.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. That's funny that you're like, oh, well, it seems like you guys are playing on easy mode over here with steady state equations and,
Yeah, it's
just like, I mean, I know
but
it's a different set of problems, but
but then again, like, and they can look at us and they can ask us like, what's your time steps? What's your how do you solve the chemistry of fire? Oh, we simplify that. Oh, you're playing easy mode. You're simplifying it way too much. They do take significant care in boundary layer problems, which we like. Not everyone acknowledges boundary layers in fire safety engineering, yet to solve with boundary layers in mind when you're solving your flows, and these guys would be very serious about them. So it's like we oversimplify some things horribly in fire as well. That is very exotic from the view of the other field, and vice
yeah,
versa. I guess that's with every field of
yeah,
engineering that uses modeling.
right. Yeah, that's definitely true. Yeah, we just know the set of parameters and the distributions that we've simplified our equations around, and, you can't account for everything. So that makes sense. Well, I wanted to just ask you to zoom out a little bit and just speak more broadly about your career experience and just ask you, like, on top of this endeavor you had going, what kind of trends have you been seeing just in your professional career? It could be in the lab or in your project work.
I guess I can talk broadly about fire engineering as I view it. One trend that's really emerging is artificial intelligence, and it's a thing that's in one way it's a black box. No one really understands how it works. It opens a whole world of possibilities that you would not even imagine without it. Yet it's difficult to handle, interpret, and make sure that you have it under control when you're using it. So it's definitely something growing, and it will be growing, and it will be amazing in the future. But to get there, it's going to be a hell of a challenge, to make sure we're doing it in a great way. Like, think about how people can misuse CFD without understanding it, and multiply it by 100. That's how difficult the AI can be if you misuse it too much. So yeah, it's a challenge, but it's an emerging trend that I see more and more in the years, and there are great people working on it. MZ Nasir in Clemson, there's Xinan Huang in Hong Kong Polytechnic University, and many others who are carving the path for everyone else in fire to use these magnificent tools. So yeah, that's a trend
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, it's so wild. You're right. I mean, I think AI is just in such the early days. I was looking at like Microsoft Outlook documentation, and I was looking, they had like little e-learning, and I was looking through their courses yesterday looking for how to do something. And like they had like 80% of their documentation was about, like, or their little courses were about AI. And it was like, what is
Really.
this? Why is it like how to create a culture within your company that's AI ready, and like all this talk about
Oh.
AI. And I'm just thinking, as you're saying this, like, this is coming and it's going to be a huge part of probably like society, like within our lifetimes, and then the next probably, I don't know how long, wouldn't hazard a guess, but
I mean, Gus,
yeah,
if we don't screw up, it's going to be magnificent. Like, you will, like, if we make it work and validate it and make sure we are using the correct tools for correct problems, AI could take over significant amount of repetitive and non-critical tasks fire safety engineers are doing,
yeah,
to allow them to focus on the things only they can solve, viewing building as a holistic technical system. No
right,
one but fire safety engineer can do that. No algorithm will ever be able to do that. You need a
right,
human being with a great understanding of fire building physics to comprehend that. and we will need these engineers. On the same hand, you don't want these engineers to focus on simple things that can be solved by an algorithm. So if we can find this beautiful golden center of having the tool, not misusing it, and benefiting from it fully, it would be a beautiful world. I'm just not sure if we can get to that point before we
Yeah,
either break it or ban it, you know? So
yeah.
there,
Well, I'm a cynic by nature, and all I can think about is your commentary in your chapter about the error percentages before we developed some of the more modern models for CFD, and how it was like 20 to 200% or something. I
yeah,
don't
yeah,
know,
scatters
but
on yeah.
I can just, I don't know. I think that maybe I'm just cynical for human nature, but about how people will use a tool with that kind of horsepower behind it. But I'm sure, just as in everything in life, there will be people who do it the right way and people who do it the wrong way.
Exactly, yeah. And that's at the same time it's one of the biggest opportunities and perhaps one of the biggest challenges we have, because we know it's powerful. We know you can use different, like AI is of course just a name for tons of different techniques and tools, and it's just a catchphrase. It's wider than CFD even. Like it has multiple flavors, multiple ways how you can implement, multiple places in which you can use a computer to help you understand your data sets and problems at hand. So we really need to learn how to use it. We need to learn how to control it. We need to learn how to know that the predictions of it are credible or not. This will be very difficult to solve, but if we get there, it's gonna be fun.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure we will. Got to figure out how we fit into that, but it sounds like you got a good idea with still providing that critical large scale oversight for the that can't easily be reproduced with the algorithm.
Yep.
But yeah, I guess just thinking about like what kind of resources do you like to use? Wojciech, it could be professional, or I'd even take a non-professional podcast recommendation if you like to listen to podcasts, or whatever you'd like to offer up to the viewers, or if you've been watching something good lately. I don't. It's up to you.
Yeah.
Dealer's choice at this point. You've done outstanding so far. So
Yeah, cool, man. A shameless plug, like there's a reasons right now, I produce it. It's a great resource. But if you ask me where I get my resources, I'm a scientist. I mainly rely on scientific papers, which is very difficult to recommend to people who are non-scientists, because you will be very frustrated by the way how they are written, and they're hard to understand and comprehend, and it's very rarely you find an answer to a problem in your paper, in the scientific papers. So yeah, that's what we scientists have to work with. And I guess there's a whole space for people like Gus, me, and others who try to build a bridge between engineers and scientists. So there are credible journals, Fire Safety Journal, Fire Technology, which are great sources of knowledge, inspiration. As I said, difficult to comprehend at points, and obviously behind a paywall, I can go a whole day about how paywalls are destroying the scientific environment and how much I hate that. But yeah, that's how it is. My I think I benefit a lot from being a member of like SFP and IFSS organizations. These memberships like give me the ability to be part of engineering community, and what they produce is absolutely outstanding. And I must say I learn more from being part of their projects, like being part of committees, being part of even writing that handbook. I would never learn that much about modeling as I did when trying to summarize my knowledge and write the handbook chapter. And the same goes into committees. If you join a committee and you have to work at a problem and try to convey that knowledge to others, you learn so much on your own. So not just consuming content and knowledge, but trying to create new knowledge, maybe a best way to gain new knowledge. So I would absolutely recommend participating in the efforts of these bodies, and possibilities are endless because the needs are so huge. There's always a committee to join and
Yeah.
participate. So these are great things. And outside of fire and outside of engineering, I'm a huge fan of Pat Flynn and Smart Passive Income podcasts. That is an amazing ecosystem of very positive way of thinking about entrepreneurship and just life in general. I've gained so much from listening to Pat, and he's been an amazing mentor. Even though I've never met him, he doesn't know about my existence. So I view him as a god in the podcast world. But it's been I'm sharing. I'm on his journey for years now, and I enjoy every step of that all the way. I highly recommend Smart Passive Income, and just Google Pat Flynn, you'll find him.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that, Wojciech. I feel like that's a nice, neat bow on the podcast. Thank you for coming on. That was awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gus. Looking forward to the next one.
Sounds good. Thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to share the episode with a friend if you enjoyed it. Don't forget that fire protection and life safety is serious business. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are by no means a professional consultation or a codes and standards interpretation. Be sure to contact a licensed professional if you are getting involved with fire protection and or life safety. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.